January 22nd, 1943, west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The jungle is quiet in the worst possible way. Second Lieutenant John B. George lies pressed into the damp floor of a shattered Japanese bunker, cheek resting lightly on the stock of a rifle that technically shouldn't even be here. Rotting timbers frame the firing slit in front of him. Rusted tins, torn paper, and a dented Japanese helmet lie where their owners left them. Around him, the air smells of wet earth, cordite, and coconut smoke. Out in front, a broad strip of open ground runs toward a line of palms and tangled green, ground that has already cost his battalion far too much. Somewhere in those trees, a single Japanese sniper works like a surgeon. A few minutes ago, a runner tried to cross the open space with a message. One sharp crack from the canopy, and the man never finished his second step. Yesterday, it was a platoon leader. The day before, a machine gun corporal. One shot at a time, always from a slightly different angle, always from above. The men are starting to say the trees themselves are cursed. George shifts the rifle in his hands. It's a Winchester Model 70, a civilian hunting gun he'd bought before the war through the mail and brought with him against every rule and all common sense. The wood is worn smooth in all the right places. The bolt runs like it's on oiled glass. Officers had laughed at it in New Caledonia. "Nice deer rifle, Lieutenant. You think this is a hunting trip?" While they issued standard-issue Garands and Springfields to everyone else. Now the jokes have stopped. For 4 days, the snipers around Point Cruz have dictated the terms of every movement, every errand, every resupply dash, every shift in the line has to be weighed against the chance of a single unseen bullet. This morning, George intends to change that, using the one cheap rifle nobody wanted at the front of a real war. Guadalcanal had already eaten 5 months of blood and steel by the time George found himself staring at those coconut palms. Back in August 1942, the 1st Marines had come ashore to seize an unfinished Japanese airfield, Henderson Field, and deny Japan control of the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. Since then, the island had been a grinding machine, night naval battles in the slot, air raids screaming in at treetop height, jungle patrols that went out strong and came back thin. By January 1943, the worst of the big set-piece battles were over, but the campaign wasn't. The Japanese weren't gone. They were just pushed back into a corner. Now it was the U.S. Army's turn to push the remaining forces into the far western tip of the island and finish the job. George's outfit, the 132nd Infantry Regiment of the American Division, was part of that slow, painful shove. On the map, their next objective didn't look like much. Just another bend in the coast near a place called Point Cruz. On the ground, it was a ribbon of open plantation and muddy tracks framed by jungle walls and palm trees, a perfect killing zone for anyone who controlled the high ground. The Japanese understood that perfectly. They had scattered snipers through the treetops like invisible mines. Some perched in rough wooden platforms lashed high in the canopy. Others wedged themselves into the crotches of coconut palms or hid behind hacked-out notches in the trunks. They camouflaged their positions with branches and fronds, then lay motionless for hours, waiting. They fired from angles. American training manuals barely mentioned, downward, from above, at men who were used to thinking of danger as something that came from eye level. A soldier who felt safe in a shallow ditch could be picked off just by lifting his head to look around. U.S. infantry doctrine was built around massed rifle fire and movement, not careful counter-sniping. Scoped Springfield rifles existed, but there weren't many on Guadalcanal, and there were no tidy sniper schools turning out specialists in George's regiment. When a sniper pinned down a platoon, the usual answer was brute force: more men, more bullets, more risk. Out near Point Cruz, that answer was failing. Every attempt to cross the exposed ground led to another body in the mud. The line couldn't move forward, but it couldn't stay where it was forever. Something had to change, ideally before the next man stepped out into the open and never made it back. The first sign that something was badly wrong near Point Cruz wasn't a grand disaster. It was how small the disasters were, and how steady. A patrol went first, just a dozen men told to feel out the grove ahead. They spread into a rough skirmish line and stepped into the open. 10 yards, maybe 15. Then a single crack from the trees. The point man folded as if someone had cut his strings. No one even saw where the shot came from. The survivors crawled back, dragging the wounded by their webbing, staring up at the branches like they were full of ghosts. Command tried to answer the way the manuals said. Machine guns were brought up, tripods jammed into the slick mud. The gunners hosed entire tree lines with belts of .30 caliber fire. Mortar crews dropped round after round into the canopy, showering dead fronds and splinters. For a while, it felt satisfying. Noise, fury, something to do. Then the guns went quiet, and the snipers simply waited. An hour later, another runner made a dash across the same stretch of ground. One shot, another man down. The message never arrived. Word spread fast along the line. A platoon leader trying to set an example stood up to shout an order and collapsed before his men even understood he'd been hit. A radio operator who thought he was still under cover suddenly pitched forward over his set, blood on the dials. A medic went to pull a wounded man back and took a round through the pack on his shoulders, saved only because the bullet hit. Cans of rations instead of his spine. Men stopped trusting the open spaces. They hunched when they walked, flinched at every crack from the trees, real or imagined. The sound of a coconut falling could send a whole squad diving for cover. From his position, George watched it all with increasing anger. He knew what the enemy was doing. In a brutal way, it was exactly what he'd trained to do on peaceful rifle ranges back home. Hit once, hit clean, and disappear. Back there, the targets had been paper silhouettes and steel gongs. Out here, they were men he knew by name. The difference was, in his regiment, nobody was officially allowed to fight back in kind. The breaking point came during a lull in the firing, in a crude command post scraped into the side of a ridge. A poncho roof sagged overhead, dripping condensation. A map of the coast was tacked to a ration crate with a bayonet. Spent brass and cigarette butts littered the dirt. Outside, the occasional distant shot echoed from the groves, a reminder that the problem was still unsolved. George laid his rifle gently across the crate, next to the map. "Sir, we're letting them choose the fight," he said. "We keep feeding men into that open ground, and they keep plucking them off. We need to start hunting them back." His company commander was tired, overworked, and not in the mood for theories. The lines around his eyes were carved deeper by weeks of bad sleep and worse news. "We're already hunting them, Lieutenant. You've seen the patrol reports." "With respect, sir, we're sweeping for them. That's different." George tapped the long, slim barrel of the Model 70. "Give me a spotter and the time to work. One rifle, one scope. We treat this like a shooting problem, not a maneuver problem. The objections came fast. What if he got hit? What if the Japanese simply switched tactics and started aiming for him? What if every officer started demanding special permission to do things their way? And beneath it all, the same skepticism. That battered civilian rifle, with its side-mounted scope and hunting stock, still looked out of place next to Army-issue weapons. George answered each point as calmly as he could. Right now, entire squads were taking losses every time they moved. His plan concentrated the risk in one pair of men instead of 30. The rifle, a pre-war Winchester in .30-06 with a rugged Lyman scope, was one he knew as well as his own hands. It would put a bullet exactly where he pointed it. He reminded the captain that doing nothing was also a decision to let the snipers keep bleeding the company dry. In the end, it wasn't his rank that convinced the commander. It was the casualty list on the table between them. 4 days, the captain said finally. You and a spotter, stay off the books, stay out of everyone's way. If this backfires, it's on you. George picked up the rifle and worked the bolt once, more out of habit than necessity. Yes, sir, that's fair. Day 1 started before. The sun had burned the mist off the palms. George and his chosen spotter, an enlisted man with sharp eyes and a quiet temperament, slipped into a captured Japanese bunker looking out toward the grove. The place stank of mold and old sweat. A few faded characters still clung to the walls where Japanese soldiers had scrawled them. They pushed aside a few scraps of enemy gear, packed a sandbag under the rifle's forend, and settled in. Then they waited. Hours slid by with only the distant thump of artillery and the occasional rattle of small arms fire elsewhere along the line. Through his scope, George saw a world reduced to inches. The curve of a palm trunk, the flutter of fronds, the shimmer of heat above the mud. Ants marched across exposed roots. Flies drifted through shafts of sunlight. It was the kind of stillness that made your muscles itch to move. But movement was exactly what would get them killed. His spotter scanned with binoculars, murmuring tiny corrections. Left of the leaning palm, higher, just below the fork. Near midday, movement. Not much, just a patch of shadow along a tree trunk that didn't quite match its surroundings, as if a darker shape was pressed against the bark. George's breathing slowed. He checked his hold, thought about distance, humidity, the tendency of heat to make bullets climb. Somewhere out there, that same unseen sniper had already taken American lives. He exhaled and pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked gently against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the dark patch jerk, then sag, a faint tumble of gear and leaves. Something dropped from the tree and hit the ground with a small, indistinct splash of motion. No second shot came from the trees, no sudden flurry of movement. For the first time in days, that particular angle across the open ground was quiet. Day 2 and 3 turned the work from experiment into method. They shifted hides constantly, a shell crater at dawn, a scrubby ridge by noon, a slit trench by late afternoon. They crawled through muck that smelled of rot and cordite, lay still while mosquitoes whined around their ears, and watched as rain showers swept across the plantation and turned the soil into soup. Each time the Japanese fired on some distant movement, George and his spotter paid less attention to the victim and more to the source, where the muzzle flash had come from, how high in the canopy, what tree line it must have been. They listened for the faint, different crack of a rifle shot compared to random jungle sounds. They learned to look for tiny betrayals. A straight line where foliage should be irregular. A knot of leaves that didn't move with the wind. A strip of bark that looked freshly cut compared to its neighbors. The faintest glint of glass. George would build the picture in his mind, line up the crosshairs, and take a single, cold shot. Then they'd move, always move. They never fired twice from the same place if they could avoid it. For every sniper they killed, there might be another one watching for the muzzle flash. Sometimes the results were immediate. A falling body, a dropped rifle, a shouted warning in Japanese. Other times they didn't know for sure until nightfall, when patrols crept out and checked the trees they'd marked on their sketch maps. More often than not, there was a body up there, or a dark stain where one had been. By the fourth day, patrols noticed they were crossing the plantation with fewer sudden casualties. Men still ducked and winced at phantom cracks, but real sniper fire had dropped sharply. There were still enemy rifles out there, but the constant surgical strikes from the treetops had turned into occasional, panicked shots. George's own tally, carefully kept and cross-checked with positions later searched by infantry, stood at 11 Japanese snipers eliminated. In a war measured in divisions and tonnage, it was a small number. For the soldiers who now dared to walk upright across that deadly stretch of ground, it felt enormous. The change along the line wasn't announced on any orders sheet. It was heard and felt long before anyone wrote it down. In the days after George's 4-day hunt, the rumor spread through the 132nd Infantry, the way all good rumors do, fast, sideways, and with a bit of embellishment. Men talked about a lieutenant with a civilian deer rifle who could see through trees and never missed. Some said he'd cleared the whole grove by himself. Others swore the Japanese had started shooting less because they were afraid of him. The truth was simpler and more important. Patrol leaders noticed that when George and his spotter were nearby, the usual sudden cracks from the treetops were fewer. Men could move between positions with just a little less weight on their shoulders. They still kept low, still used cover, but the feeling that death might drop on them from any random branch started to loosen its grip. A few officers who had scoffed at the Model 70 now asked to look through its scope to feel how smoothly the bolt ran. They asked quiet questions about holdover, wind, and how he'd learned to pick out a human shape in a wall of leaves. Quietly, attitudes shifted. Sniping stopped being something the enemy did to them and started to look like a skill they might cultivate for themselves. If one well-trained marksman with a reliable scoped rifle could make a section of front safer, what could a handful do? George didn't create a sniper school on Guadalcanal. He didn't redraw doctrine by himself. But his success became part of the growing recognition across the U.S. Army that precision marksmanship and optics weren't luxuries or toys. They were tools that, in the right hands, could save far more lives than they took. John B. George survived Guadalcanal and kept fighting. Later in the war, he served in the jungles of Burma with Merrill's Marauders, applying the same mix of calm observation and hard practicality against a different enemy in a different jungle. He eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and after the guns went quiet, he did something just as important for the next generation. He wrote it all down. His book, Shots Fired in Anger. preserved not just the story of one cheap mail-order rifle at Point Cruz, but dozens of small lessons about weapons, training, and the realities of close combat. Which rifles held up in the rain, which sights fogged, which tactics worked when the terrain and the enemy refused to cooperate. Quietly, that 4-day sniper hunt near Point Cruz joined the long chain of examples showing that in war, a single determined specialist with the right tool can change the way everyone else fights. In the end, it was just one man, one rifle, and 4 brutal days. But for the soldiers around Point Cruz, that mail-order toy changed everything. Stories like this come from real memoirs and records, with some moments and dialogue dramatized for storytelling. If you want more forgotten World War II stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what we should cover next.